Hello and welcome to MedTech Talks. I'm your host, Shania Fenton. Medicine is on the verge of a monumental shift as disruptive technologies empower scientists to combat diseases in new and improved ways. One such technology is germline genome editing, or GGE for short. This is a modern invention that enables scientists to artificially manipulate the genetic makeup of an embryo, resulting in heritable changes present in all cells of the future organism. Joining me today to discuss this topic is Lukas Stevens, Nathan Hawkins, and Thomas Monnox. Lukas, you're joining us from home today. Let's start with you. GGE has become a bit of a hot topic recently. Why?
Shania, GGE is actually a concept that has been around for quite some time, but it wasn't until recently that we were able to perform GGE efficiently and with precision. This has sparked significant scientific interest concerning GGE's potential clinical applications to prevent genetic disorders in future generations, ranging from late onset Alzheimer's disease to cystic fibrosis. However, as you'd expect, genetic engineering of this kind is quite controversial. This is primarily due to the safety concerns surrounding the use of GGE and the potential for abuse. There's also a plethora of ethical, social, and legal implications as well.
I'd like to get to those concerns in a short while, but first, I'd like to know more about the current legal framework surrounding GGE. Nathan, what can you tell us?
Well, Shania, the legislative framework basically comprises two Commonwealth Acts: the Prohibition of Human Cloning for Reproduction Act 2002, the PHCR Act, and also the Research Involving Human Embryos Act 2002, known as the RIHE Act. Broadly speaking, the PHCR Act contains a list of offences pertaining to genetic manipulation. Importantly, Section 15.1 of the Act states that a person commits an offence if A, the person alters the genome of a human cell in such a way that the alteration is heritable by descendants of the human whose cell was altered, and B, in altering the genome, the person intended the alteration to be heritable by descendants of the human whose cell was altered. A person who commits an offence under this section is liable for up to 15 years imprisonment. On the other hand, the RIHE Act regulates research involving human embryos. Under sections 10 and 10A of the Act, an embryo may be used for research purposes, subject to a license being granted, but only where that embryo is an excess embryo harvested during assisted reproductive technology treatment, or an embryo created by a process other than natural fertilization. Under Section 20, this license is valid for a maximum period of 14 days, excluding any period when development is suspended, after which the embryo must be destroyed.
Nathan, Section 15 of the PHCR Act sounds a bit vague to me. What exactly is it prohibiting? Is it the performance of GGE culminating in a pregnancy that is illegal, or the performance of GGE simpliciter?
Well, that's the thing, Shania. As Taylor Sands and Gingell observed in their 2018 article, it is unclear whether this prohibition relates only to reproductive applications of genome editing or extends to research applications of genome editing on early embryos where there is no intention to implant the embryo. When read in conjunction with the Lockhart report, the modern purposive approach to statutory construction arguably supports the narrower reading of Section 15. Importantly, recommendation 26 of the Lockhart report states that the creation of human embryos using the genetic material from more than two people, or including heritable genetic alterations, should be permitted under license for research. This interpretation would, therefore, permit GGE for research purposes under a license pursuant to Section 20 of the RIHE Act. Although it should be noted that there have been no applications to conduct such research in Australia to date.
Wow, sounds complicated. I'm interested to know whether other countries are grappling with this issue as well. Lukas, can you shed some light on this?
Well, Shania, the answer to your question really varies from country to country, but it does seem like the Australian regulatory framework is lacking in comparison to foreign regulatory frameworks. For example, in Israel, the prohibition of genetic intervention, human cloning, and genetic manipulation of reproductive cells law, 1999, prohibits the use of reproductive cells that have undergone a permanent intentional genetic modification in order to cause the creation of a person. Accordingly, GGE conducted for research purposes and not intended to cause the creation of a person is perfectly legal in Israel. Thus, compared to the Australian legislative framework, The Israeli Act has been academically praised as a concise and simple statute that leaves no room for confusion.
I now want to move to some of the ethical, social, and legal issues. Tom, tell us what you believe the key issues in these areas are.
Now, while there are many issues surrounding GGE, three in particular come to mind. The first is the ethical concerns surrounding the selection or removal of genetic traits for enhancement purposes. As McPherson, Roquet, and Segura suggest, by allowing parents to control aspects of their child's genetic inheritance, an expectation is engendered to create the best embryo, thereby eliminating the potential for supposedly antisocial embryos. This approach has been strongly criticized in the past, as it has the potential to perpetuate prejudice in society and constrict the public perception of normality. The second issue worth discussing involves the potential social injustices precipitated by unequal access to GGE. Should GGE become a reality, unequal access and cultural variations influencing uptake might result in significant discrepancies in the relative occurrence of a given condition in society. As Ormond et al. Observe, genetic disease, once a universal common denominator, could instead become an artifact of class, geographic location, and culture. The third issue that comes to mind concerns the legal consent of future offspring. Clinical ethics recognizes that parents are the best decision makers for their children, that is, until they acquire their own autonomy. This has also been well established at common law in Gillick and West Norfolk and Wisbech Area Health Authority, and subsequently in Marion's case. By extension, we may infer that parents are also the best decision makers for their future offspring. However, the anecdotal reports of children and adults born in wrongful life cases would suggest otherwise, highlighting a real tension in the law about consent of unborn persons. This tension is exacerbated by the fact that GGE is not only impacts future children, but also the children of those children. Who, if anyone, has the right to make decisions on their behalf?
A very good question, Tom. Let's conclude our discussion today with one last question. Where do we go from here? Tom, what are your thoughts?
I think I speak for everyone when I say that given the nature and number of unanswered ethical, social, and legal questions, it would be grossly inappropriate to perform GGE that culminates in human pregnancy. However, there appears to be no solid reason to prohibit in vitro GGE for research purposes, but in order to facilitate this research, reform in Australia is absolutely necessary.
Nathan, what about you?
Yeah, I agree with Tom. Reform is vital. I think we should seriously consider amending Section 15 of the PHCR Act to clarify that a person can be authorised by way of a licence to alter the human genome in a heritable way, provided that the embryo would not be used to cause the creation of a child, to use the words of the Israeli Act. It would also be useful to combine the legislation into one simple and concise act to avoid any further complications.
Lukas, your thoughts?
I agree with Nathan. Amending the legislation this way would bring Australia's regulation of GGE in line with international standards.
Thanks, guys. Well, I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. Thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you next time.